anything you say about Enlightenment could be used against itself, because it's really a historical label that is attached to an impulse in humanity. And all impulses in humanity, like everything in this cosmos, cast a shadow.
Even if we're just thinking in a very Eurocentric way about the Enlightenment, it's not a neat and tidy story. And then, unfortunately, there's the whole world to think about as well.
Welcome to The In-Between, a project by the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, presented by the Ethics Centre. My name is Danielle Harvey, Festival Director and one of the curators for this project. I'm recording on Gadigal land in Sydney, Australia. While FODI has been on pause, we have watched a virus sweep across the planet, movements rise and figures fall. Perhaps in the midst of all this uncertainty, what we are actually witnessing is the end of an age and the dawning of a new era. Across this series, we will sit between historians, philosophers, researchers, writers and scientists as they contemplate how we got to this point and what our future holds. Accompanying each conversation is a short creative response documenting this moment in sound. Our first conversation is between Joya Chatterji and Stephen Fry. They speak about the Age of Enlightenment, a movement defined by reason, progress, freedom and rational thought, and whether or not this is coming to an end. Joya Chatterji is a fellow at Trinity College. She has written extensively about the partition of India, its legacy and migration. Stephen Fry is a British actor, writer and presenter whose commentary spans politics, history and mythology. They're in conversation with festival co-curator and the director of the Ethics Centre, Simon Longstaff. This conversation was recorded remotely in November 2021. On behalf of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, I acknowledge the long history of thought, storytelling, care for community and land that has carried the oldest continuous culture through millennia and that continues to teach us today. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country, to elders past and present, and to all First Peoples of the many lands where the conversations in this podcast took place.
Well, first of all, let me welcome Stephen Fry and Joya Chatterji. Joya, can you give me a little bit of a description of where you are at the moment?
I am at home in Delhi. Right outside my window is one of Delhi's greenest belts. It's what's called the lung of Delhi. So I'm very lucky to be where I am because Delhi's in the middle of its worst pollution crisis, which is not unrelated to the Enlightenment. So it's both a pleasure and a kind of trigger to some of the thoughts I've been having about it. And I'm actually in my son's bedroom, which I've converted into a study. So please forgive this total mess of papers and things you can see around me, in the middle of trying to finish a humongous book, which Simon knows all about.
And how did you come to be a historian?
Now that's a matter of falling in love. My first romance was with history when I was 11 years old, very young, very impressionable. And I had a marvelous history teacher who, in a very conventional school, just started a lesson by reading from a primary source. The source was from the 11th or 12th century, and it was jaw-droppingly like time travel to a hugely different world of ideas and perspectives and scenes and settings and materialities that just, I couldn't be the same person after I left that class, and I'm still grappling with that encounter.
Stephen, whereabouts are you? And I wouldn't even try to describe you. You're such a polymath as to that, so I'm not sure what you would pick out as something as a signal moment on your journey.
Well, I'm in central London. The sun is shining off a window almost into my face. And if I look backwards, I can see the spire of St. James's Piccadilly, a Christopher Wren church, a symbol of the Enlightenment, if ever there were one. Who I am and what I am, I don't know. Without claiming to be Jean-Paul Sartre, I more or less reinvent myself every day in terms of what my curiosity might lead me towards. But I am more than anything, I think, animated by that, by curiosity. I have a fat tummy and I have a fat mind if I do, simply because in both cases I'm greedy. I'm always greedy to learn new things and to try and understand new ways of looking at the world. And I hope that'll never stop. Every day you go to school, they say in Spain, although I heard a very, very good remark on the radio the other day. Someone said, you learn something new every day, don't you? And the other person said, really? I didn't know that. I thought it was rather pleasing.
Yeah. Well, I think to be a curious man, there's few things better than that. Stephen, you gave a very eloquent account of just the place and its Enlightenment resonance. What do you think is the historical, if you like, grounding of the Enlightenment? What's its essence that we see through history, at least as you perceive it?
I mean, again, a joke can sometimes lead to the best way of understanding what's wrong with this way of looking at history. I remember a friend of mine who was a very witty soul was asked in a quiz on the radio what the last words of Queen Anne were. And he said, alas, with me dies a whole period in table legs. And it's good because it points out the absurdity of these barriers and boundaries in history, as if there are these kind of doors that shut and open. But certainly, if one wants to lay out in the normal school way, there was this scientific revolution, if you like, that was begun by Bacon and figures like that, and obviously taken up by Newton and Pascal and many, many others in the West we're looking at the moment, of course. And along with the humanism of the Renaissance and so on, came new ways of thinking about how the individual had an autonomy. Rather than being part of a hierarchy in which their autonomy was severely compromised by the king, the lord, the church hierarch, all these castes of priestly and worldly authority were questioned. And I suppose the central figure there in Western philosophy is Immanuel Kant, who actually wrote a famous work called What is the Enlightenment? Was ist die Aufklärung? And it is usually summarized as his little phrase, dare to be wise, sapere aude, dare to be wise. In other words, think for yourself. You are here on this earth and you have your own brain and your own experience and your own ability to find out where we come from, where we're going. And we owe it as a duty to future generations, not to close off debate, but to keep it open, to think about things and to use logic and reason and one's senses as best one can, rather than taking the authority of others on the basis of revealed religion or a constitution and so on. This was all deeply compromised by the French Revolution, which was seen to be the kind of reification of this philosophy, but turned into a bloodbath, the terror. And maybe this gave rise to a new German anxiety about the French influence of the philosophes, as they were called, the intellectuals. But there's always been a counter in Enlightenment. There have always been, of course, priests and holy men who have hated the idea of this, the taking away the power and authority of the church. But there have also been others who saw the pluralism and openness of the Enlightenment and its modification by Romanticism as being dangerous and leading to terror and tyranny, many would say. That's my sort of, if I were a school teacher, I suppose what I would try and get across. But I think there are many questions there, and I'm sure Joy will have a much clearer sense of both how limited Eurocentric it is, but also how, as a historical analysis, it's very cartoonish.
Joya?
I think that was grand. It was far from cartoonish, and it was very useful in the way you separated out the French from the German, from the British. You didn't mention the Scottish and the different traditions of the Enlightenment, each of which generated different elements into what we now consider as being a single great thing. So I think it's very important not to think about it as a singular tradition, and we think about what we might regard its central ideas as, say, reason, commitment to scientific principle, commitment to the individual or individuation, commitment to the, above all, progress, as being some of the core ideas that bind these different traditions. But on the other hand, you have things that tear different sections, even of the Western Enlightenment, apart, such as liberalism versus republicanism, and so on. So even if we're just thinking in a very Eurocentric way about the Enlightenment, it's not a neat and tidy story. And then, unfortunately, there's the whole world to think about as well. And that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So one very influential tradition is that actually the Enlightenment and modernity didn't just happen in one place. Different varieties of modernity were kind of sprouting up in different parts of the world where the ecosystem was right, where you had enough accumulation of capital, where you had significant growth of political power, and so on and so forth. And in these different zones, you had different kinds of forms of Enlightenment traditions emerging, which we might marginalize and call vernacular Enlightenment or vernacular modernities, but nonetheless they did exist. And many would go further and talk about cross-cultural encounter between these different forms of modernity. And really, something as simple as recognizing that the Bible wasn't the truth, historically, it didn't tell a historical truth, as coming from cross-cultural encounter between Darwin and the rest of the world. Suddenly realizing that actually, oh dear, I mean, it's not simply possible that the Bible has it right. So it's scientific on the one hand, imaginative on the other hand, artistic on another level, but at a deep level, culturally complex and layered. The second thing that you have to recognize is that there is a powerful anger in the non-Western world. You may wish to call it the global south. It's a kind of term that slightly irritates me, but never mind. We can stick with it for ease of conversation. There's a powerful feeling that this enlightenment was forced upon the people of the global south by colonialism. And it was forced upon them through a civilizational matrix. And obviously only the Western powers were enlightened, and every other power was measured according to every other society's civilization, because they spoke in terms of civilizations in that period of history, was measured according to how enlightened, i.e. unenlightened, it was. So Africa was beyond the pale, India was a little bit higher, and every other society could never really progress to the level of the West. So we can't talk about it as if it's this sort of flat rolling out of a carpet that happens in this even way.
No, it's not syntagmatic, as I think is the word they use for that kind of unrolling. But I was very interested by this idea that it was a kind of energy that arose around the world simultaneously, because that seems to have happened before, doesn't it? I rather enjoyed Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher's idea of the axial age, in which he pointed out that at the same time that Aristotle and Plato and Socrates were changing the way we thought in the West, in Athens, at the same time the Old Testament prophets arose and created the Talmudic and biblical kind of energies that went into Christianity, and Buddha and Confucius walked the earth all at the same time. And I think it was your point about capital making the Enlightenment possible, and in Jesper's point, I suppose, in modern, very fashionable evolutionary psychology and social anthropological paleontology would tell us that for the first time humans had the calories and therefore the leisure to stop and think and speculate and inspect the world. Maybe it was as simple as the fact that plagues began to stop affecting the world quite as badly as they had for the previous 100 years. There are all kinds of people and books that privilege one particular kind of social or physiological upheaval. It could be the arrival of wheat or rice, or it could be the new ways of fishing. But something clearly happened that gave humanity a kind of new energy for inspecting and reasoning, and maybe also for believing in individuation, as you rightly call it, this idea of the autonomy of the self.
So what I wanted to follow that up was by saying that the arguments I was talking about are in the sense of pushing back against the Enlightenment, critiquing the Enlightenment, talking about the Enlightenment as part and parcel of colonialism in the context of colonized societies. That is very much part of the intellectual sphere. And that there is another section of society, which is the much larger section of society, which is the base, where actually one sees a very different story, and which is where I would argue against Simon's sort of notion of the death of an era. I would argue that we're seeing a huge energizing of a certain kind of enlightenment, where there's a huge urge for progress. There's a huge urge for science-based medicine. People want that. They want clean water. They want schools. And above all, they want opportunities. They want education. They want opportunities for progress. They use the word progress as a political term. They want progress for their children. And it's wise to recognize that there's an energy there. And that's an energy for enlightenment.
I think that's very, very good. And that also reminded me that there's an amusing fact that in English, and I don't know how true this is of other languages, but the word we use for enlightenment, as in Aufklärung, as in the Kantian sense of the word, is exactly the same word that is used to describe something very unenlightenment in those terms, which is Buddhist enlightenment, the kind of enlightenment you think of when people, especially in the West, fiddle around with Eastern ideas and philosophies and religions. And there's a suggestion in both of them that human beings have an apprehension, if you like, of something that lights the mind and connects things up as light does. When you're in the dark, everything is separate and everything, you bump into it and it has no relation to anything else. But when the light is on, you see things as they are. And I think it's a deep human feeling. Why can't we see properly? There's something we're missing. We need light to shine upon us and to shine upon the world so that we can connect things up and know.
I think you'll both agree that there is no end to the European Enlightenment. In fact, I think you'd say, both of you, there is no such thing as the European Enlightenment. There are various movements toward enlightenment. Is it fair to say then that also there was no beginning to it? That it just blends back seamlessly into the history of humanity?
Like the famous rising middle classes in history, that there isn't, no matter how far you go back, you can always put the sentence in your school essay. And at this time, the middle classes were rising up as never before. And you can say that in the 14th century England, you can say it in Rome or in Greece. Obviously, you can say it any time later. And I suspect, yes, I mean, you can look at the beginnings of Renaissance humanism as being very much the seeds of it in Europe, certainly. So even going back as far as Peter Abelard and the first kinds of movement of humanism within very strict church hierarchies, you could still find these little blades of grass pushing up through the stonework of the churches and eventually flowering a little later. So it probably is impossible to go back too far.
If you proceed that, you've got the whole period of the Islamic Enlightenment.
Yes.
You know, the Islamicate is Enlightenment, where you have a huge flourishing of science and mathematics. What was then so we call now the Islamic world. It was they went through a very rich period of enlightenment, and preceding that, if we go back even earlier, there was a period of enlightenment around 600 BC, where you had a number of philosophers in the Indian subcontinent who were doing things like, for instance, discovering there was such a thing as zero, which is the beginning of mathematics.
Yes.
So there is a sense in which you can continue to unravel this concept backwards and backwards in time, and it's only if you look at it in this very particular way, which is indeed, it's a spectacular thing that happened in Europe at that time, but spectacular things happened at other times too. So
what it says to me is it's not something which is marked out by a beginning or an end in time, but rather it's a tendency, wherever it arises, of a certain kind of valuing of rationality over superstition, a certain kind of valuing of the individual rather than just the collective, and that varies from place to place. I understand that too. Is that something that you think is right, that it's not a temporal thing, it's more an outlook, a worldview, a way of being?
It is what T.E. Hume, the philosopher, called a concrete flux of interpenetrating intensities. It is both a flux and concrete, and it is the intensities that interpenetrate from all kinds of different directions. It's a preposterous phrase, but it's one of my favourites. But it is, to return to that joke about Queen Anne table legs, it isn't, and then one day Goethe spoke, or one day Kant spoke, or one day Rousseau, or whoever. They do interpenetrate. And, of course, the mercantilism and the beginning of the movement around the world that caused the horrors of empire, but also the flourishing of trade in both goods and ideas, is something that the Enlightenment made more welcome. It meant that ideas from Japan, China, India and Africa were more likely to take some sort of root slowly.
So the Enlightenment, we've talked about many of its great achievements, but it also produced world wars, it's produced global warming. I don't want to just give a line of all of the bad things, but you can't pretend that it hasn't also thrown up. You even mentioned it, Joya, when you said looking out your window at the green lungs of Delhi, you mentioned that was one of the legacies, the pollution of the Enlightenment. So whether it's still expanding or whether it's fading, what are the great triumphs of the Enlightenment in its worldview, in its multiple forms, whether you pick it from the Scotland or Germany or France or India? What would you want to carry forward into the future? And what, if anything, would you want to leave behind from it? What are its darker side that you think we ought to try to remove from our world?
Well, I'll go for that if I may, which is firstly that I don't really accept this idea that the Enlightenment as some separate thing is responsible for world wars and communism and revolution and all the rest of it. It was clearly preceded them, and in as much as there is cause and effect to everything, what caused the Enlightenment? Well, whatever caused the Enlightenment caused those wars that came after the Enlightenment too. It's pure logic. It isn't difficult to see that. So you might as well say that Aristotle caused the Second World War. I mean, it's the same argument that sort of definitively shows there's no such thing as free will, really, isn't it? It is simply cause and effect going back and back. But you could argue that by loosening the shackles of ecclesiasticism and the monarchies of the world and allowing a new kind of dispensation that included republicanism and parliamentary democracy and various other versions, including French case revolution followed by empire and so on, that yes, those were energies released by allowing us to think for ourselves rather than taking on trust the scriptures of Catholicism or any other religion. And what is good in the Enlightenment is still, I think, what Kant said. Dare to be wise, dare to know for yourself. Don't take anything absolutely on trust. But that, of course, also lets in a kind of fanaticism and lets in what we now call conspiracy theories and mad views of things. They say, well, I'm just doing what you said, Stephen. I'm thinking for myself and I'm discovering and researching for myself that vaccines don't work. And I'm discovering for the fact is anything you say about Enlightenment can be used against itself because it's really a historical label that is attached to an impulse in humanity. And all impulses in humanity, like everything in this cosmos, cast a shadow. they can be very, very bright. And the brighter they are, the darker the shadow they often cast. And that's obviously true of artificial intelligence and the internet and science generally, that it has some bright and extraordinary achievements. The reduction in child mortality, the longevity of humans, the reduction in disease and poverty has been real. And the outlook for most human beings is better. We know more, so we can see more suffering than we ever used to, but we can't unenlighten ourselves as far as science and political thinking go. We can't unknow what we know. We can't unlearn history. We move forward, whether we call it progressivism or just the natural progress of one year following another. That is bound to continue, and we can't abandon ways of thinking logically, reasonably, and empirically, testing those ideas. So in that sense, the Enlightenment is as much a part of us as hair under our arms or language. It's something that the humans have evolved around the world. And as in all evolutionary traits, they start in one particular territory and then they move and develop and take on different features in others. Joya will have a better perspective.
Joya?
I wanted to say something, although I agree with a lot of it, but it's just, I'm saying it because I'm sitting where I'm sitting, and the things that concern me are very much inspired by the place where I'm sitting. What's one of the things that I would like to take forward about the Enlightenment, which will go on whether we want it to or not, it's not in our hands, is actually food security. There's been a huge amount of scientific research, which is, strangely enough, Indian scientists collaborated with Pakistani scientists to make the varieties of rice that created the Green Revolution, which now mean that India is self-sufficient in food. That's not to say that we don't have starving people. That's another issue altogether. But we do need to use science for these basic issues of hunger and disease, and actually direct it towards the issues that are glaring. And somehow we can't just keep it restricted in our universities, in our lovely beds. But I also wanted to make a plea that in societies like India and many others, where we have authoritarian governments which make the freedom of speech difficult, there are many people in danger, particularly people who work on social, economic, historical, philosophical questions. And it's quite important to give them solidarity and support by, helping them in some ways, inviting them abroad or trying temporarily to give them a refuge, because they're being arrested every day. We live in dangerous times.
I just want to push back a little bit on this sense that the Enlightenment is summed up by a desire for progress and technology and other things, because both of you spoke in part about a certain kind of autonomy that people have. And I wonder then whether or not you're sensing that there's a closing down in some sense of the open-mindedness, which is some assert to be part of that Enlightenment project, which produced the technology. Whereas you can have a very closed mind. You can have a totalitarian state that can produce lots of technology and prosperity and a sense of progress. And you can have a very fractured society where every dissenting opinion is shut down because it offends some individual's perspective. And I think, as Stephen has put it elsewhere, people just shout across at each other across a chasm of difference. That seems to me to be a threat to this ideal of enlightenment that you're talking about. Now, I wonder what you make of that, whether or not you see this as something which is weakening it, or it's just a phase that people go through and will come back to a more balanced position. Joya?
I would say that the Enlightenment is not one thing. It's many, many different ideas that have come out at different times in different places and don't necessarily cohere. So if you stick with that model, you can understand why different societies, different countries have produced their own versions of Enlightenment models and created a structure that they feel works for them without necessarily adopting full individuation, which we associate with, say, democracy or liberalism or republicanism, whereas other societies haven't. In fact, the majority of societies, and let's just face it, the majority of the world has not done individuation. So that's one of the problems in thinking that the Enlightenment has happened and it's over. Enlightenment is happening. One of the areas in which you see it actually happening is in the Hindi movies, in Bollywood. Because I've been following the movies really now from the 30s to the 2000s. And you can see gradually the figure of the individual emerge. Initially, he or she only speaks in song, in romance. We hear the self only in the context of a romantic, intimate conversation, which is absurdly impossible in day-to-day life. But it's an idea. It's an idea that is put there for the people, and the people love it. I mean, obviously, it's the most famous and most public form of entertainment. But now you gradually begin to see that this idea of the individuated self grows and grows and grows and develops all manner of features of power, of despair, of, I suppose, an emotional interior. He thinks differently, he wants something, he exists. And you begin to see that so powerfully by the end of the century. So individuation is happening. It's in process. It's underway. So again, I think it's too early to say that it's over.
I think that's beautifully put, Joy. Really interesting. It makes me think also, of course, that there's an even bigger question now. And that is when the Enlightenment, as we think of it, grew up, the world was still a hierarchical place. And there were hierarchies to question God and king and lord. And there still are employers, bosses,
Families.
power structures within families. But there's a historian with whom we probably both, all three of us, disagree violently, called Niall Ferguson, whose views on empire and things are somewhat counter to the prevailing work that people like Joya are doing. But I do think he gets one thing right, and that is that society has, almost without our noticing it, morphed from a hierarchical structure to a network structure. And network structures are reticular. They have nodes that connect lines. And the way we communicate and the way we individuate within a network is different to the way we have typically done within hierarchies. I notice in things like comedy, for example, that you can no longer, unless you set it in the past, like a thing I did called Blackadder, for example, you can no longer have the comedy of the anxiety and stress and rebelliousness of the hero stuck between hierarchies. The boss, the general, the prince they have to please, and the servant that they can bully. And the comedy that comes from the reciprocation throughout those sort of classes, the sandwich of a hierarchy, is simply no longer possible in a film. And this obviously leads us to one of the major problems of our era, just in current terms, as we think about social media and about that sort of issue, and, you know, the annulment of certain people because of their views, and the care we all take in order not to upset a node somewhere along the network. So I think that makes an enormous difference, because you can look at all these things intellectually on paper, but forget the soil in which they're expected to thrive today is a different soil from the soil of yesterday. It's a network soil, not a hierarchical one.
I think that you're absolutely right. We do have a networked society. However, we still have a hierarchical society. That's not dead yet. No. It's alive and well in 3/4 of the world, and it's probably alive and well in many European homes along axes of gender, a lot of axes of sexuality, honor, etc., masculinity. There are many things we could talk about.
Stephen and Joya, are there any final thoughts on this topic just before we go?
Well, all I would say is that anybody interested in this subject should dive in head first and find out what they can find out. And I think they'll find it an extraordinary journey, because it is really a journey of ideas, how humans have thought about themselves and the society that we find ourselves in when we're born. And at its best, Enlightenment is just a way of offering you a torch so that you can look into the darkest corners.
Thank you, Stephen. Joya, any final words from you?
I think it's more complicated than that.
Of course it is. Everything is more complicated than I say it is.
Nice to meet you,
Nice
Stephen.
to meet you, Joy, and thank you for putting up with my nonsense.
I saw you at Hay and I was most impressed. You were lovely.
Very honoured. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Joya Chatterji, Stephen Fry and Simon Longstaff. Accompanying this episode is a short response in sound. It features music made from archives of the first recorded sounds and the words and voice of Sydney-based writer Tasneem Hossain. In our next conversation, we sit between Peter Singer and Sam Mostyn. The In-Between is an audio project by the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, tell your friends, rate and review us online, or subscribe for the next episode. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas will make its return to Sydney in 2022 on the 17th and 18th of September. Sign up for program announcements at festivalofdangerousideas.com. That's where you'll find full bios on today's speakers and artists, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is proudly presented by the Ethics Centre. The In-Between is supported by the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales. Thank you also to our generous supporters of the Ethics Centre and the Festival of Dangerous Ideas.